Hello, Wake Up New Zealand, Karasaki speaking. Well, you'd think I'd be happy that David Seymour wants a referendum on the Treaty of Waitangi. Well, I've been looking at the original Maori version of the Treaty of Waitangi, which is our founding document, and we should be all proud of that and celebrate it because, this is our founding document for all of New Zealanders, not just for a minority. So how many people really understand the implications of what's going on right now? The referendum that David Seymour wants, on the principles of Te Tiriti or Waitangi. The people are being lied to. It appears these political leaders have immoral immunity. So the Prime Minister's Cabinet, they have a guidance, a rule book for all parliamentarians and their admin staff around how they apply any policies around the treaty. So they use several versions, the English and Maori version, and they cherry pick it wherever they want, put it in wherever they see fit, so it's fit for purpose for public policy, and also of some iwi of what they have said and put that in there as well. So they have corrupted the original founding document of New Zealand. So the 12th of October, David Seymour was talking about enshrining the treaty principles, acknowledging the treaty has principles. The original treaty did not create principles, nor did it create a partnership. So he talks about this, saying that the principles need to be properly understood in our constitutional setting. An act would promote the treaty as it was actually signed, not the diversive version invented by judges and academics. But this is forked tongue because he is acknowledging what has been introduced by the judicial and the legislation of Parliament in the 1980s. So ACT has said, they have consistently said the treaty is a tonga and that its principles provide the basis for a modern liberal democracy. The government is sovereign, he said. It's a job to protect property rights, and we have equal rights and duties. ACT says those principles should be codified in legislation, and New Zealanders should be allowed to vote on them rather than allowing the courts to change our constitution. He's talking about codifying legislation with the principles. There's no principles in the original Treaty of Waitangi. So I have a problem with David Seymour here. The principles of Treaty of Waitangi being codified in legislation, and New Zealanders should be allowed to vote on them. This is what he says. Firstly, ACT refers, they have consistently said that the treaty is a tonga which lacks direct English language. There's no translation in English. This refers to a Maori language word that refers to treasured possession in Maori culture. This is a founding document of New Zealand. All New Zealanders. Article 1 of Treaty of Waitangi says that the Queen is the sovereign, that Maori chiefs actually ceded sovereignty to the Queen, that they are her subjects, like all English subjects, her English subjects, with the rights and privileges of those subjects, like everyone else, no more, no less. The treaty is not a valid treaty in international law. It doesn't have an independent legal standing as a part of New Zealand law. It only becomes law of New Zealand in situations where Parliament declares it as a statute. Although Parliament does refer to the principles of the treaty, Parliament has never defined them. So they haven't defined the principles. So there's various lists as to the principles, treaty principles, Not even the list decided on by the courts actually reflects what the treaty actually says. The suggestion that Māori did not understand themselves when they ceded their sovereignty to the Queen is a lie. So that really is a lie. That's dishonesty. Te Tiriti of Waitangi, the original version, did not have principles. They are lying. If the treaty was embedded in the New Zealand Constitution, this is what it means. The rights of Māori under the Treaty of Waitangi would be recognised and affirmed. Māori would be legally entitled to pursue claims for natural resources, for example, water and other natural resources, taonga, forever. This means public and private property that you may own legally. This would be treaty principles imposed upon in the courts, and this would mean they could rewrite Acts of Parliament. The Waitangi Tribunal would be able to make recommendations that privately owned land would be returned to Māori ownership, and Māori would have precedence over non-Māori in the distribution of healthcare, education, and welfare. See what's happening now? Constitutionally based treaty rights could entitle criminals with Māori ancestry to preferential treatment to a gentler sentence than anybody else. In 2005, Treaty Tribes Coalition, especially South Island tribe, Ngā Tahu, maintained that the greatest shortcoming of New Zealand's current constitutional arrangements is their failure to fully recognise the fundamental significance of the Treaty of Waitangi. This is when Peter Dunn, United Futures leader, was undertaking a sweeping review of New Zealand's constitutional arrangements. So two constitutional groups, namely Auckland University Professor Margaret Mutu, convened a iwi Leaders Constitutional Working Group. It was a self-appointed group pushing for a separatist constitution based on the 1835 Declaration of Independence that resembled the UN Declaration for Indigenous Peoples' Rights. So that runs in parallel with the legislation that corrupted the originally Māori Treaty of Waitangi. So David Round, a law lecturer, spoke for a further group, the Independent Constitutional Review Panel, issuing a Declaration of Equality, thus rejecting the Treaty of Waitangi, its principles, in a constitutional document. Wanted such references to be removed from all existing legislation, including race-based parliamentary seats abolished, and he wanted race-based representation on local boards abolished. Also, the Waitangi Tribunal abolished. Nothing came of that. So you have New Zealand's founding document that has never been legislated upon, then becomes legislated upon. The original Māori version of the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi should be celebrated in its original glory. We should be really proud of it, not for it to be a separative one that divides our nation. So we need to take it back to its original glory as to where it was, where it had no principles in it. There was no principles created in the original Māori version of Treaty of Waitangi and no partnership. So in this case, every law in New Zealand, if it was entered into the Constitution of New Zealand, every law in New Zealand would be liable to challenge as being as a breach of the rights of Indigenous people. Hence, no settlement claims. The corrupted Te Tiriti o Waitangi runs parallel with the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights. Funny that? In which iwi elite and the Māori Party are pushing, where Ardern's cabinet signed off on the first draft of the UNDRIP to be implemented in New Zealand, and it wasn't till about 18 months later, through an OIA request, that it was found that they had done this. November the 21st or 23rd last year, 2023, Aotearoa New Zealand Centre for Indigenous People and the Māori Law Review and other iwi partners convened a conference at Auckland University, the theme being Career Constitution. And on the second day, Naria Mahuta opened that day up with a speech. There were overseas guests in attendance, and it was reported that discussion, advice, information took place where the government had an opportunity to engage with academic experts, iwi elite, about constitutional law and Indigenous rights, thus transforming New Zealand's constitution, recognising Māori rights in Treaty of Waitangi, referring to the Declaration of Independence and the UNDRIP. So when ACT Party David Seymour said that the Principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi should be codified, the original founding Māori version of Treaty created no principles to be codified. What's he on about? It's being politically corrupted by legislation. And he wants more legislation through referendum, a referendum that I do not trust. I do not trust the government. Citizens in New Zealand have no indecision rights around citizens' referendums. We have no legal right. The government will always have end decision making rights. So I believe there should be no acknowledgement at all of the UNDRIP and legislation. Just amend the Treaty of Waitangi back to its original state with no principles and no partnership. Take all principles and partnership out of legislation, and the corrupted Treaty of Waitangi, and recognise that there's no principle of partnership in the original created Treaty of Waitangi. So I myself, I said, I don't believe the government's referendums, and really and truly, we have no decision-making rights as people, so why would you trust them? So the legislative principles and the partnership corruption of Treaty of Waitangi runs parallel to the UN Declaration for Indigenous Rights. That in 13th of September, Rosemary Banks was representing New Zealand, the Labour government. She was at the UN Assembly, and on behalf of New Zealand, she rejected the UN Declaration. But later on, John Key secretly made arrangements with Peter Sharples in 2010 to go and sign that UN Declaration, knowing full well what it meant. So we have on the 13th of September, when Rosemary Banks was at the UN Assembly, there were three other countries that actually rejected it. It was US, Canada, and Australia. They also rejected. All have turned about face. They all agree with it now. So New Zealand had a role in the implementation of the text of the UN Declaration prior to 2007. However, it was found that they still wanted to reject it. So Rosemary Banks said, with deep regret, New Zealand is unable to support the text presented before the UN Assembly. There was difficulties with 4 provisions in the declaration, that they were incompatible with New Zealand's constitutional arrangements and legal arrangements. 1, the Treaty of Waitangi, the governing for the good of all New Zealand citizens, Article 6 on lands and resources, natural resources, on redress and compensation, and Articles 19 and 32 on right of veto over the state. This is why it was rejected. And the provisions on lands and resources could not be implemented in New Zealand. Article 26 stated that Indigenous people had a right to own, use, develop, or control lands and territories that they had traditionally owned, occupied, or used. For New Zealand, that would mean the entire damn country. It also comes under the scope that it requires recognition of rights to lands now lawfully, legally owned by New Zealand citizens and other people. So this does not take into account the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of Indigenous peoples concerned. It also implies that Indigenous people have the rights that other people do not have. Article 28 on redress and compensation also comes under the scope of this declaration. That means those people who legally own property that iwi, that Indigenous people could get compensation on that legally owned property. So it says here, it does not take into account the fact that land might now be occupied or legitimately owned by others or subject to numerous different overlapping Indigenous claims. The UN Declaration implies that Indigenous people have a right of veto over democratic legislature and also natural resource management. And that is happening now. The UNDRIP implied different classes of citizenship where Indigenous people have a right of veto that other groups, individuals, do not have. And the provisions in the Declaration include provisions that are fundamentally incompatible with democratic processes, legislation, and constitutional arrangements. Rosemary Banks reported that under the UNDRIP, it was explained by others who supported it that it's an aspirational document to inspire, was not meant to be used for legal purposes. She also added that the history of the negotiations on the UN Declaration and the divided manner in which it had been adopted demonstrated that the text did not state propositions that were reflected by the state practice, which would be recognised as the general principles of law. In other words, divide and conquer, separatism. This is what she's on about. And goes on, as for the terminology. Now, I want to talk about the terminology quickly on these words, Indigenous people, because it certainly wasn't written or it wasn't created in 1840 either by the English version or the Maori version of the treaty. This was established by a Tanzanian parliamentarian by the name of Pakipuni. It was later on promoted by George Manuel, president of the Canadian Indian Brotherhood. He was key to establishing the World Indigenous Council. He played a part in the preparation of this UN declaration. At a gathering of the UN Assembly where the World Indigenous Council were giving a speech, 100 protesters walked out of that assembly because they said they had not consented to be being classified as Indigenous people. Early in 1970, George Manuel visited New Zealand and met with New Zealand politicians and some Maori entertainers, where he talked seriously about this Indigenous peoples. He then went on to Australia and he spoke to Aboriginal students there. He communicated with world leaders and met with them. And he travelled extensively. So this terminology, Indigenous people, travelled worldwide with George Manuel. It became well known. So, as I say, our original founding document never created either principles, partnership, Indigenous peoples, none of this. Personally, I do not believe we need a referendum. Just expose the truth. Destroy the political, legislative corruptness that's been deliberately perpetrated into our founding document that we should be very proud of, Te Tiriti of Waitangi, the original Māori version. We do not need the dark side of politics actually corrupting our founding document as it has. So let's take that original founding document that had no partnerships, no principles in it, and go back to the original Treaty of Waitangi. Destroy the parliamentary legislative corruption, the damage that it's done, the separatism, the division, the name calling, the character assassination, all of that, even relating to white supremacy, white privilege, and it goes on and on. As people feel, if they talk about this, they're walking on broken glass, and they are. We need to change that. Let us, the people of New Zealand, be the ones to show the world we are proudly one people of one nation, God's own. Yes, let's go back to being God's own New Zealand, and God bless New Zealand. Wake up, New Zealand. Share, 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 and share.